Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am your host, Shavinyaa Vijaykumarr, a research analyst at the Institute. Sri Lanka is currently facing its worst economic crisis in 70 years. This economic meltdown sparked a political crisis. Frustrated Sri Lankans, who see no end to their burdens, have taken to the streets. The protest pressured the Rajapaksas to leave not only high politics but also the country. The political vacuum formed by the Rajapaksas saw the former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe take office as president, with Dinesh Gunawardena serving as Prime Minister. Amidst these developments, Sri Lanka is seeking its 17th IMF bailout loan. To understand Sri Lanka's economic and political situation, I am joined by two researchers from ISAS, Research Fellow Dr Chulanee Attanayake and Post-doctoral Fellow Dr Rajni Gamage. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you, Shavinyaa.
Thank you.
So, with the year-high balance of payment and foreign exchange deficits, the long-term dual deficit problem has finally caught up with the Sri Lankan economy. At the beginning of the economic crisis, the dominant narrative that gripped the media was the Chinese debt trap issue. But the economic crisis was revealed to be more complex than that. Dr. Chulanee, would you care to give us a brief overview of the economic crisis and explain what caused it to end up in this precarious situation?
Yes, Shavinyaa, I think you basically gave a very brief overview yourself about what has been happening in Sri Lanka. So, Sri Lanka's economic crisis has been in development for a longer period of time. But what the world saw during the past few months is sudden drastic decline in the current situation. The country is engulfed in a declined forex reserve. When President Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into office in November 29, the foreign reserve stood at nearly USD 8 billion, and then it started declining. The following year it was 4 billion. By December 2021 it was down to less than 2 billion. Now, with no forex, the import of essentials such as fuel, gas, medicine and food items became a problem. Blackouts began in mid-January like this year, extending to 90 minutes at the beginning and then became lengthier for sometimes even more than 10 hours per day. Doctors constantly started warning about increasing shortage in medicine. Food supplies are threatened largely because of the fuel crisis, because without fuel there was no way of transporting vegetables and fruit, fish, etc. from one part to the other part of the country. And because of this, the experts predict now acute malnutrition, which will rise from 13% to 20%. Now, this crisis, as I said, which has been in the making, there are several factors, both internal and external. Sri Lanka has always had a structural economic problem that has led to macroeconomic instability. Economic mismanagement by successive governments since the independence has created a what we call as twin deficit problem, forex deficit as well as a balance of payment problem. Even though Sri Lanka opened its economy in 1970s, we really did not make use of that opportunity to have an export-led economy. Instead, we have an import-led economy. And then the successive governments have had tax reductions and tax exemption policies since early 1990s. So in 2021, its tax revenue was only 9.6% of the GDP. So these are some of the internal factors that has led to the crisis. Externally, of course, there was the global pandemic, which has affected the economies worldwide. And then as a result of this, Sri Lanka's general remittance coming from tourism and migrant workers declined at a very rapid rate. And then there was also the Ukraine war, which has led to inflation in fuel prices and commodities all over the world. So these are some of the factors that has led to the current crisis. As you mentioned at the beginning, yes, the narrative has been about the Chinese debt trap, but when you look at it more closely, Sri Lanka's current debt problem is not merely because of the Chinese debt. We have larger debt problem with the capital markets.
President Ranil Wickremesinghe has been leading talks with the IMF to secure a 4-year bailout program that could provide up to $3 billion. He has informed the parliament that the negotiations are progressing, but did not provide a timeline for when a deal would be finalized. What economic policy revisions should the current government focus on during this negotiation period? What are the important deliberations the current government need to have during this time? Dr. Rajni, would you like to share your perspective on this?
Sure. Thank you, Shavinyaa. So just to get a brief snapshot of where the Sri Lankan economy is at the moment, the IMF has estimated that Sri Lanka's economy will shrink 6 to 7%. And so what we can expect is to see more people being pushed below the poverty line. As you mentioned, the Sri Lankan government has estimated that obtaining funds of around US dollars 3 billion would be sufficient to cover for essential goods and services for perhaps the next 6 months. And this is what they hope to obtain by securing the 17th rescue program with the IMF. So recently, President Wickremesinghe communicated that negotiations with the IMF have been pushed backward to September. And one of the reasons that he cited for this was the instability that is caused by the protests. And there is perhaps cause to question this statement because we have seen that IMF negotiations and programs in other countries such as Lebanon and Pakistan have taken a protracted period of time. So to answer your question on what kind of economic policy revisions the current government aims to implement, I think it's important to look at why the IMF suspended its funding facility, which had been finalized in 2016. So the IMF program was suspended in 2019, and one of the main reasons for this was that the economic policies pursued by the Gotabaya Rajapaksa government were contrary to fiscal consolidation. And among these policies were what Dr. Attanayake mentioned about there have been tax cuts that were implemented in 2019. And so what the IMF really is looking for is for Sri Lanka to restore its macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability, while at the same time protecting the poor and the vulnerable sections of the society. And so to obtain this, what it would require is for Sri Lanka to step up its structural reforms on the one hand, so as to address its vulnerability to corruption, and then to unlock Sri Lanka's growth potential, so to improve Sri Lanka's productivity, economic productivity. So the policy reforms that the government has so far communicated are threefold. First, it has engaged in tightening monetary policy. Second, it has indicated that it is open for pursuing state-owned enterprise reforms, such as the Electricity Board, the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, and Sri Lankan Airlines. And third, the government has started to pursue a policy of tax amendments, of increasing tax, such as increasing the VAT tax and corporate taxes. In terms of the challenges and tensions that are likely to emerge as the government pursues these economic reforms, I think one of the main challenges that we see playing out even now is the opposition by workers' unions and trade unions to privatization and state SOE reforms. And this has been a part of Sri Lanka's history because opposition to privatization SOE reforms is also part of the nationalist, populist kind of discourse that has been closely associated of late with the Rajapaksa political dynasty. second thing that the government has, one of the challenges that the government is facing is, of course, in order to pursue these painful economic reforms, it will require a degree of political stability and buy-in from all the political parties that are in parliament. And this is proving to be increasingly difficult. The president has issued a call for support to form an all-party government. And while there are certain members of the opposition that have indicated support for a common minimum program, the major opposition parties are unlikely to join the government because they see the government as basically defending the Rajapaksa interests because the parliament is still dominated by the Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna, the SLPP, which is the government closely affiliated with the Rajapaksa political dynasty.
Sri Lanka has approached its friendly neighbours for economic support. India and China play a significant role in Sri Lanka's efforts to resolve the economic crisis. Dr. Rajni, could you please shed some light on how Sri Lanka's neighbours and other big powers have stepped in to help Sri Lanka's economy?
So thank you, Shavinyaa. If you look at the economic assistance that Sri Lanka has obtained in the context of the crisis, India comes foremost among its neighbours. This year alone, it has provided around $3 billion in the form of currency swaps, credit lines and loans, but also in terms of emergency assistance, providing medical supplies, fertilizer and so on. You then also have assistance by multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, which has reallocated some of its existing financing projects towards crisis funding. Japan has also been an interesting case in the context of the crisis, indicating that it has been unwilling to provide bridge financing while the prevailing instability persists in the country. I think that China is a very interesting case when it comes to Sri Lanka. Like you mentioned before, Shavinyaa, there's a lot of talk about the Chinese debt trap. But this thesis can be questioned in the case of Sri Lanka. Paris Club members, initially, during the initial phases of the Sri Lankan crisis, Paris Club members invited China to be part of the debt restructuring talks. And there was a bit of talk at the time that China was not willing to be part of such multilateral engagements. But recently, what we have seen in terms of China's behavior in the international realm, we saw that recently China has indicated willingness to engage in debt restructuring with Zambia, thereby paving the way for an IMF bailout program with Zambia. And I think that this provides a precedent for cases such as Sri Lanka. And it also questions the myth or the thesis that China is not willing to work within multilateral fora like the IMF to assist countries such as Sri Lanka.
There are several caveats which come with accepting support from neighbouring powers, one of which is to maintain good relations with these supportive powers. The recent Chinese spy ship issue has resulted in some tensions with India. What should Sri Lanka's foreign policy stance be to navigate the big power rivalry successfully? Dr. Chulanee?
Yes, Shavinyaa, I think this is a very interesting as well as a tricky situation for any small country who face similar kind of geopolitical power struggle. Now, first of all, this so-called Chinese spy ship, which is called Yuan-15, is a third-generation tracking ship of Yuan-1 class, which it's been made to track and support satellite and intercontinental ballistic missiles by Chinese army. But China is not the only country who possesses ships of this kind. Russia, United States, France, United Kingdom, North Korea, all these countries have similar kind of facility and technology. Even India does. So, this is not the first ship that is coming to Sri Lanka. According to a retired admiral from Sri Lanka who mentioned during a recent local program, between 2020 and 2022 alone, there has been 125 vessels that have docked in Sri Lankan ports by different foreign countries. That I think even included a warship from United States. So the whole hype about Chinese ship docking in Sri Lanka comes with other geopolitical aspects. As we know that there is a strong competition and a conflict brewing in the Indian Ocean region between United States and India led West and China. So India is, and especially the Indian media, is extra sensitive to anything that is happening in Sri Lanka when it comes to China. So the whole discourse we saw around this ship is a result of this. So in this context, Sri Lanka should be very careful in navigating a situation like this. We have always mentioned that we are following a non-aligned foreign policy, but we have seen with different administrations, there has always been tilt to one side or the other. So the first and foremost, even though this is a very difficult, economically difficult time for Sri Lanka, the first and foremost thing that we have to do is to avoid getting tilted to one power or the other, and also to prove that we are a non-aligned country by proving through our action. So rather than making policies according to the interest of one party or because of a pressure from one party, it's better that we base our decisions on existing international policy frameworks such as rule-based order. So what we actually have to think about is whether docking this ship would have any impact on our policy on rule-based order, and we should make our decisions based on this. I think that's why Sri Lanka obviously agreed for the Chinese ship to dock in Hambantota port at the moment, and this is also a greater economic opportunity and an opportunity for education and technological transfer for Sri Lankan scientific community. So we should not let go of a situation like that. In the meantime, we should also show to the other parties that we are in control in a situation like this. So we should make initiatives to go for our Navy to go and observe, for our scientists to go and observe the technology and show this in public media, so that the other countries know that we are not being swayed or controlled by anybody's decision. Sri Lanka is making a decision on its own. I know it is a very tricky situation because of the economic crisis, but in my belief, yes, Sri Lanka is in economic crisis, but the reality is that Sri Lanka is in a way more strategic position in the Indian Ocean region. All these countries want Sri Lanka in their strategic orbit, so we have some advantage in that regard. So we have to be able to be creative and use this to our advantage and set the precedent for our foreign policy for the years to come after this crisis.
Let's shift our attention to domestic politics. Political observers have pointed to the unprecedented scale and period of protests in Sri Lanka as an indication of an end to the old political order and a beginning of a new era in the country. The Rajapaksas family was ousted from high political office in Sri Lanka. So, Dr. Chulanee, do you think this is the beginning of the end for the nepotism and cronyism that has plagued Sri Lankan politics for decades?
Well, we hope that it would be the end for the nepotism and cronyism, but I have to admit that the dynastic politics and patronage-based politics has always been a character of Sri Lankan's political system. And these dynastic families have always rise and fallen from time to time. When one family falls, there's another emerging. That's exactly what has happened over the period since the independence. I'm sure Rajni will be in a better position to explain this because that's a specialized area. I think with the Rajapaksa administration, what we saw is that this dynastic politics taking into completely a different level. According to some media articles, I think somewhere that was published somewhere in 2014 or 2015, during the second term of Mahinda Rajapaksa administration, there has been more than 40 members appointed to government posts. These were not excluding cabinet portfolios. So they were completely controlling the entire system. So that eventually led to their demise. So I think even though I'm not so confident to say that dynastic politics will end from here, because for instance the current president Ranil Wickremesinghe is very much likely to hand over his party to his cousin Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was a former MP. In this context, I do not know whether it will be the end, but I think this provides some insight to how people would react if they take control of too much of space. I do not think people will tolerate it.
We spoke about the political system from the elite perspective. Let's now talk about the Sri Lankan civil society. So, the economic meltdown sparked the political crisis. As an observer of the current state of Sri Lankan politics, my question is, do you see a fundamental change in the demands of Sri Lankan civil society? In this sense, do you think the protests are more reactive than proactive? Do you see Sri Lankans demanding genuine change in politics, or do they just want to see an end to this economic crisis? Dr. Rajni, would you care to share your perspective on this?
Yes, Shavinyaa. So I would agree that there has been a shift in the nature of the people's protests in Sri Lanka. The Janata Aragalaya, or the people's struggle as these protests are known as, when they started out in early March this year, they had a number of demands, and foremost among these was first chasing the Rajapaksa family out of politics and recovering the stolen funds that the Rajapaksa family was said to have facilitated and stolen. The second was that they demanded for relief from the economic crisis. And then along with this, there were the demands for greater accountability, transparency, for greater responsiveness of government to the citizens that they are supposed to represent, and for greater efficiency of government in delivering the basic necessities to the citizens. These demands still remain within the people's protests, but I think that in the evolution of the Sri Lankan crisis and in the evolution of the mass protests, we see May the 9th and the week of July the 13th, of July the 9th, as being really determinative moments in how the mass protests have evolved. One of the things we see post May 9th was that with the appointment of Ranil Wickremesinghe as Prime Minister, we saw the nature of the mass protests transition to some degree. There was a lesser composition of middle-class protesters, and there was also the real or perceived dominance of certain far-left anarchist elements within these protests. The second main shift we see is in the week of July the 9th, where with former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigning from office, we see that the main slogan of the protests, which was "Go Home, Gota," no longer been there because it has been achieved now. And I would argue that in the period after this, that there is not so much a rallying force or a rallying common cause that can bring together the diverse sections that comprise the mass protests. And so to your question of whether the mass protests have become reactive, I would agree in large part to that. We see now the mass protesters, many of them asking for elections as a solution to the current crisis. The protesters are in large part not appeased by the all-party interim government that the current political leadership is attempting to form. And they are calling for a type of system change. And I think that this is perhaps the main fault line that is now emerging in the Sri Lankan context, which is that the protesters are asking for a system change of clean politics, of politics that can deliver their basic rights. But on the other hand, the government sees this system change in a fundamentally different way. President Wickremesinghe recently commented on the need for an economic reset. So we can see how the president is trying to align his agenda as meeting the demands of the protesters, that this system reset is delivering what the protesters are asking for in terms of a system change. And if we look at what President Wickremesinghe terms as within this system reset, it's economic on the one hand, but it also includes the promise of constitutional reforms through the 22nd Amendment that has been proposed recently. Measures such as the parliamentary oversight committees, other institutional reforms like the institution of a Jana Sabha, which is a people's council. So these measures that are trying to portray themselves as bringing in more youth and bringing in more non-MP experts into the parliamentary deliberative and democratic process. But I think that this is where the main fault line emerges, whether the government is able to successfully convince that they are meeting the needs of the protesters. And just to finally, I will say that there is also reason to believe that the government does not fully believe that it is able to meet the needs of the protesters. And this explains why, after President Wickremesinghe comes into power, he has pursued a very consistent strategy of intimidation and crackdown on the protesters, on trade unionists, in a way preempting the kind of resistance or the kind of unrest that would emerge as the government is now about to implement very painful economic reforms and as its legitimacy is increasingly questioned by the people.
Thank you both for sharing your insights. You are listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates through social media. We are on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.